like local board does good. And so we're looking forward to hearing you tonight, and Brendan, been waiting for you, buddy. Thanks a lot.
Thanks everybody for showing up tonight. I've got a microphone here, but can everybody hear me fine? One of my specialties is causing reverb, and I don't want to do that tonight. So I appreciate you coming out and supporting the history of the area. And I want to talk to you about something that many of you, if not all of you, know a bit about. I hope that I can convey something new about it, but that's just how Maritime, Virginia is. Inland Virginia is very maritime in nature, going back thousands of years. And Farmville is no different than those places, and a lot of that has been hidden in plain sight. And there's a lot of folks here who's paddled on the Appomattox River. I know we've got some stalwart paddlers here. It's a beautiful place that I encourage you, if you haven't been, to just go and see and enjoy and try to think back to what it would have looked like maybe 150 years ago when it was our main highway here into Central Virginia. Next slide, please. So I work for the Department of Historic Resources. Most of you, if not all of you, have heard of DHR. We do a lot of various things around the state. I work for our more public side, where we answer questions, quandaries that landowners have about what they've found after the rain washed a plowed field or what washed up on their beach. That's my division. Next, please. But we have everything from historical architecture down to in archives. A lot of historic preservation tax credits, and as I mentioned earlier, battlefield protection and preservation programs. So we're always working on that, and I'm happy to be on the road a lot, finding, learning, and then presenting. So next, please. The underwater program that I am fortunate enough to be a part of, there's 1.65 of us. I'm full-time, my assistant is part-time. We're tasked with 2.14 million acres of submerged bottomland here throughout the Commonwealth. That's everything from 3 miles off the eastern shore, all the way to the Clinch River, all the way to the westernmost region of the state. Anywhere there's a sizable, really in some areas a creek, a small river, anywhere that humans have been doing stuff on in the water and have left some tangible component of that, it's our job to record that for posterity. And also to encourage citizen involvement with stewardship, because there's only one of me, so I don't know how many years it would take to do all 2.14 million acres, but certainly a lot more than I have. And so it's a shared resource. All history is a shared resource. So we are cheerleaders for people when they find it to help preserve it by not loving it to death or taking it and selling it just for the monetization of it, so that the same discovery that we have now can be shared with future generations. Next, please. A few little facts here before we get underway. I've already mentioned that Virginia is incredibly submerged. We're I think the seventh wettest state in terms of coverage. And basically 85% of state-owned lands are covered by water. My boss did not know that fact. May not have hired me when they thought just the Chesapeake Bay and some water offshore, but statutorily it is a lot more than that. We drain to the Gulf of Mexico, so we've got trade networks historically and prehistorically to the Gulf, and also to the Roanoke, all the way down to the Yadkin River in south central Virginia, and of course the world's greatest estuary, the Chesapeake Bay. Next, please. A thing that I always flog in presentations, especially inland, is if you're unaware of the Virginia River Atlas series, I don't get kickbacks for these things, but if you like history, you like rivers, and you like Virginia, you ought to have at least 1 or 2 of these. I think the Virginia Canal and Navigation Society, really under the charge of Dr. William Trout III, or Bill, have put together an atlas for just about every river that you could turn a canoe around in here in the state, and a few else. He's working on one for the Potomac right now, for the upper Potomac. And they're available online, they're cheap. If you canoe a lot, get 2, because you'll ruin one. Next, please. Going back to all the different river basins, where a droplet of water falls and where it ends up. Next, please. Next.
Go ahead.
Next, please. Okay. So when I started work here in the state, being tasked with a large area, we try to spread ourselves around as much as we can, and that's what we still do. So we work from the Nansemond River here in downtown Suffolk. Next. You can just kind of click through these. Recording as we come upon historic wrecks. This one in particular was a part of documenting the big change in how oystering was done, moving from all wild caught to aquaculture, which is now a huge mainstay, to documenting how wrecks and wreckage travels along the eastern shore, on the example of Paramore Island over in Northampton County, or in Accomack County, to a bug-eye, another traditional Chesapeake style of boat that's recently been very rapidly eroding out of this marsh area, completely uncovered in a couple of months, and very intact, but a very unique piece of Chesapeake history. Next, please. To the very first wreck that I found here in the Commonwealth, which is a little ferry in the Maury River in downtown Lexington. Not where I would have expected to have found the first submerged intact boat in my task, but there it is, resting against an old Great Wagon Road bridge piling. Next, please. So we're out there on the banks of the James, on the banks of the Rappahannock, next. And even inside of the mountains. If you could go through these. This is, if you'll pause here, this is the result of about 2 billion laser points inside of a tunnel. What's a maritime archaeologist doing inside the Blue Ridge? Well, this is how you got a canal boat and a canal through a very inconveniently placed mountain chain. That's how you get a cargo that's been unloaded at Petersburg or Norfolk all the way to New Orleans when the Florida Peninsula was owned by the Spanish, very also inconveniently. And so from the early days of George Washington and other great promoters of inland trade networks and commerce, intermodal commerce, wanted to see canals were the way forward for our young republic and a late colony. And this is one of those cases. This is a cutaway looking inside the mountain of where a canal tunnel stopped in 1856. And to my knowledge, it's the only example of 19th century tunneling, canal tunneling specifically, that's left intact where we can actually study it and see it. Most were taken over by the railroad, or never started, or finished and abandoned and caved in. Next, please. But y'all came to hear about the Appomattox. From Planterstown, Petersburg, and points beyond. Next, please. I'll go through these fairly quickly, but basically the story starts in the early 18th century. As no surprise, the area becomes more populated. Stores start following people. Stores follow farms, and stores need stuff, and farms, plantations need stuff. They need to get their stuff, tobacco, wheat, out, and they need to get things like fancy china and pianos in to spend the money and to create the economy. So it's no surprise that by the middle of the 18th century, the Virginia House of Burgesses started drafting laws for many rivers, including the Appomattox, that said you gotta keep the rivers clear of rocks, shoals, and trees. And so they said this is gonna cost money, so we now issue an order, and so that enables people to levy tolls, taxes, creates basically what we call a corporation today that's authorized to sell stock in it to be able to pay for these massive projects. Because as we know, trees are constantly falling in the river, and the maintenance work is never complete. So by the late 18th century, you have increased interest in the river. The Appomattox is somewhat unique in that it was never really canaled. It was what you call a still water or run of the river navigation. Things were done to improve the channel by making sluices, and then, of course, millers were constantly damming creeks and waterways. So by the mid-18th century, you've got laws that say, sure, you could build a mill on the Appomattox, but you have to build an accompanying lock and bypass canal so the traffic can go around the mill. Thanks to the Supreme Court records, we have a lot of cases where that, to greater or lesser degrees, didn't happen, and people got to arguing about it and writing about it. And so those decisions help document a lot of these attributes to the early Appomattox. By the early 19th century, you can see that the cost of transportation on the Appomattox is 1/3 that of land transportation. Roads were muddy, poorly, all it takes is a good rain in the 19th century to stop commerce, basically. Well, good rain rises the river, more boat traffic, as long as it's not in flood stage. So when the roads are dry, land transportation might be a little bit cheaper. And you've got 120 navigable miles, basically from about 20 miles upstream from here, all the way down to the falls or the canal down there in Petersburg, where you go around that fall line and intersect with tidal trade. So schooners, brigs, snows, ocean-going traffic. So by about the 1840s, no surprise, right before railroad, every time I say railroad, you have to say boo, because good for Farmville, but bad for the railroad business. That was the height of trade on the Appomattox. That's when the tolls were collected, the most tolls were collected, and that gives us a good picture not only of how much was going, but what was going. Because crushed rock was tolled or taxed differently than tobacco was, that it was taxed differently than China or other sorts of dry goods. You've got more and more surveys in the mid-19th century, as more interest in concepts of adding canals. One thing that I found quite interesting is that in 1825, Farmville was going to be a big junction where you had a canal that would have connected down to the Roanoke Basin and down into North Carolina, and another canal taking you up to the James. Imagine if the James had penetrated through the Alleghenies and off to New Orleans. You could now literally take a waterborne cargo from Farmville inland to New Orleans. I mean, a long way, but nonetheless, really expanded. And the concept in everybody's mind then was Britain. They were modeling, if you've been to England, Scotland, Wales, much lesser degree Ireland, but there were huge canal systems, over 3,000 miles of canals in Britain, and all these networks of interlaced canals with locks and ship lifts. That was in the mind's eye of Benjamin Latrobe and Washington and other folks that were aware of the British canal system. So that's really kind of where we were going to go until the reason this building was built arrived in Farmville in the early 1850s, and you had the South Side Railroad here. The last traffic on the river itself here in Farmville was in the 1870s that I'm aware of. And then the canal at Petersburg, which was the only way to get out into big water, closed finally in 1902. And what was left of the Upper Appomattox Company was sold to Vepco, now Dominion, in 1935. Next, please. So this is what Benjamin Henry Latrobe paints. And many of you, all of you have seen this, but this is the only image, so to speak, of the 18th century Appomattox. There are a number of these that he painted for the James and the Appomattox. And this was supposed to have been done somewhere here near Farmville. Next, please. And this is where we're going to go to. This is the area, basically the mouth of the Appomattox. Down near Petersburg, you've got City Point down here, which happened to be the world's most energetic and active port in 1864 and 65 for obvious reasons. And then Petersburg itself. And you have to put yourself in the shoes of 19th century and 19th century Farmvillians in that your concept of what you connected to through to the outside world was really Petersburg. Remember, in 1800, Richmond was, yes, a city, and yes, it had a growing industry, but Petersburg was really the place. And that's why Petersburg, like Richmond, ended up having the same number of railroads and a vibrant canal system. You go through it today, it would be hard to believe it, but by the mid-19th century, it was the theater capital of the South. It had more theaters than any other place in the South. And it really kind of vied with New York and Boston. Next, please. Many of us have seen this image too, the Great High Bridge crossing over. This is really almost kind of putting a stop to the commercial viability of the river itself. But commerce isn't the only thing that's going on in the river. Next, please. So back in 2020, I wanted to go out and figure out what we had around Amelia. We'll run through some of these fairly quick because I imagine many of you have seen these. But what resources are there that have either been documented and maybe have changed in the past 30 years that someone's gone to photograph, measure, record, draw them? And also, what's been washed out? Because the only constant with the river is change. And a site that we knew 2 years ago may look very different after tomorrow's rainfall for obvious reasons. So I went out to Clementown Mill here. Next, please. And started documenting a number of sites. And by the way, if any of you were in the Friends of the Appomattox River presentation at the library last year, I've got a lot of slides here that we couldn't see that evening, so finally brought them back here to town. So I wanted to inventory cultural resources along and in the river, revisit recorded sites for the reasons I just mentioned, and then document newly exposed resources along and in the river, and try to find new ways to basically do more with less. That's something that we, working for state agencies, are always struggling with. It's a happy struggle, but fortunately we have lots of new and great technologies that really expand our abilities. LiDAR, drone survey, and of course the good old permissions to walk somebody's property and see that really are never equaled or beat. Next, please. Start pairing all of these things together, and these are the methods for the project that I ran, which was to start with the documents, go to the river, apply additional technology, and compile this into a report, and then see where we could go next with this. Where were our weaknesses? What did we not do well? What could we add to? And so put it out amongst my peers and to DHR, who was my then reviewer instead of my employer. And so that's where we set out. Next, please. Starting with Bill, because Bill had paddled all of these waters. And next, please. Also going to, of course, a lot of the earliest maps. We often give 17th and 18th and 19th century maps not the value we should. And sometimes they look silly. And you know, they don't match up with what we see now with satellite imagery. But indeed, there's more than meets the eyes often. And of course, the 17th century, north is always to the right. So next slide, we'll turn north, right side up. And here's the Appomattox, as it was called, river coming down off of the James Flu, or the Powhatan Flu, as it was often known in the early 17th century. Next, please. Moving into the 18th century map, probably our most commonly cited and used map would be the Fry-Jefferson map of 1753. And now we see a lot of detail. This is an inset, of course, and a local inset, but the little bends and things in these creeks are pretty much spot on. It always has amazed me, from the John Smith map, or in this area, in the Spanish maps of Florida, how much detail went into this. It wasn't just a squiggly line. A lot of work went into making sure the squiggle and the distance from the next squiggle were pretty much right. And in this case, they are. Next, please. And then this is a good 19th century example of how we added a bit of topography. We are now putting on some names and then some of the transportational features along the river, such as the number 7 bypass canal right there at Randolph's Gravel, a notorious shallow spot in the river, aptly named because it's shallow and gravelly, and you to go around it, you have to dig a canal. Next, please. So this is the area that I covered. Not all of that by foot or canoe or kayak, a lot of it by LiDAR. Next, please. So this is what the river looked like when I was there. I think the Appomattox is an intensely beautiful river, especially in the fall. It tends to be, you know, kind of slow and pokey, often choked with fresh leaf fall, but it really brings out some of the nice colors and you can see the topography the best as the leaves start to come off the trees. Next, please. I also did a couple of the several miles of a major navigable tributary of the Appomattox, Flat Creek, one of 2 major navigable tributaries. Flat Creek was navigable for about 18 miles up from its confluence with the Appomattox and was used until the 1880s. So even after Farmville had stopped receiving boat traffic here, the lower upper Appomattox, if you will, was still partially viable commercially. Next, please. Some of these places I went and, you know, you don't see what you want to, but you still have to go there. You have to go there to tell somebody it's not there anymore. Historic photographs. This is the only photograph I know of Clementown Mill, taken, I believe, in the 1920s. Since then, I've actually found an oral history. It was a recorded oral history from the son of the man who bought this mill during the Spanish influenza of the 19 teens. And it was the second historical incidence of social distancing, shall we? The mill was transacted this way. The man buying the mill went and put the money on the stump and walked back. And the man selling the mill walked to the mill and put the key and took the money and walked back. And the mill had then been sold. That was how they socially distanced in 1918. Next, please. Clementown Mill goes back to the early 18th century, the 1840s, I believe. It was also known as the Mumfords and the Brazil Mill, that was finally operated by the Luckadoo family. And if you go on YouTube, you can find that oral history. Old Mr. Luckadoo talking about how the mill was sold and what it was like when he was a kid. This is pretty much all that's left of it, a bunch of footers there in the river. That being said, that's the most of any mill that actually stood over top of the Appomattox that is left. And the water room, part of the lock, still there, and most of the dam is still there. The canal and bypass lock would have gone around. That's actually been built over as canal traffic was no longer necessary in the early 20th century. Next, please. Another image of that would have been a large wheel there on the right-hand side of that, what was the old canal lock. This mill at one point had, I believe, in 1813, I think 6 runs of stone. but that's 6 pairs of stone that are running at a time. That was, I believe, a Farmville Mercury newspaper that was advertising its abilities. Next, please. And one of the stones surviving there at the mill house, 2 years ago now, I was able to save from a certain ignominy in a Dinwiddie flower garden. They're beautiful in flower gardens, but I hate to see them disconnected from their history. And so this one's sitting at our farm now, which is about to go to the Amelia County Historical Society to keep the story together and keep the stone there. And it's a really beautiful example of a millstone, about 3,100 pounds of Virginia conglomerate. I just had the state geologist confirm that. This was made near Christiansburg. I don't think it's ever been used, and it was made specifically for flowering. It still has all the little cracking lines. Never been used. It's hard to come across that. I thought that in itself was unique, as well as its story, connection to Amelia's history. Next, please. And there you can see the cracking lines. There's not many stones and how shiny it is that still have that brand new finish. Next, please. Tucker's Ford Lock and Dam. This is all that remains from an 18th or 19th century canal lock. The other wall is a pile of rubble in the river. Locks were intensely expensive to build and to maintain, again, which is one of the reasons we find so many occurrences in the law of somebody not maintaining it. You would only really have to raise a boat, maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet at most, but nonetheless, they were leaky, they were always rotting. They usually used wooden doors and wooden bottoms to them, which were constantly being hurt by floods and of course, just normal decay. So a lot of these didn't last very long, and this one's about ready to fall into the river. Next, please. One of the other mills I was able to work with, this is right off the river, probably 300 yards, sits on Giles Creek. Giles Mill goes back to about 1800. That's how far back we can go. This was the last standing mill in Amelia. It actually fell not long after this project was completed. Next, please. I'll go through a number of slides from that. This is in the 1960s, going down Giles Road. There's the mill on the left-hand side. And this building over here, I was told, for a while operated as a casket factory, and then later served as storage. Next, please. The mill as it stood, 5 stories. Next, please. And one of its unique things is, and one of the things that still does stand, is the mill wheel. Most mills were upgraded to a much wider mill wheel. You see them all over the place. They're made out of sheet steel, not iron. This is a wrought iron mill. It's called a shrouded wheel, 21 feet in diameter, I think about 11 horsepower I've calculated, with about 6,000 foot-pounds of torque. Try stopping that. But this is probably the original wheel to that mill. It was never updated or modernized, and which is rare for this area to have that sort. So that's actually kind of a unique feature to that mill. Next, please. And it also had a hybrid set of gear. A lot more wood than iron in it, which a lot of that was phased out. Mills are horribly susceptible to fire, and of course wear, and just everything from termites to explosion, wears and tears on them. And this one actually survived amazingly well, and it was used, I think, until 1963. Next, please. And there's that shrouded wheel still sitting. Next, please. And there it is after collapse. You can cycle through the next couple pictures here, and as it's deconstructing itself, not too much left of that. The stone foundation will stay for a while. Other stone things that tend to persist are where people crossed the rivers and built big bridges. We know all about big bridges here in Prince Edward in the Upper Appomattox, but this is one of the old Goods bridges. This is the early 19th century abutment. And of course, this is the site of a Revolutionary War skirmish where, at the time, Major Anthony Wayne rebuffed Colonel Tarleton there at a crossing. There was a brief Civil War action there as well in 1864. Next, please. And all of these, I've made somewhat of a side study. All of these abutments are trees grow in them, the trees get big, the tree gets heavy and falls over, and when it does that, it basically jacks all this stone out of place. And so that's the biggest enemy to a lot of these old stoneworks, or little trees, little tiny trees that end up kind of prying them apart. Colonial diking is something that I found intensely interesting because it's really handy when people put lines around their fields and around their farms. And that's what you do in the low grounds to protect the corn from a spring flood. In the off season, you send all that extra labor down there, mostly enslaved labor, to go dig and place soil. Next, please. And start building all these lowland dikes. Some of them might only be 2 feet high. Many of them were probably much taller and have been eroded down. This yellow line is slightly more than 3/4 of a mile. And that's just a little bit. In fact, there's some more down here. As creeks shifted their course, you'll often see how the dikes express where the creek was, and you can date when that shift took place if you know when the dike was put in. And because it's such a massive infrastructure for the landowners, when you have a flood knock it out, real often you simply don't have enough labor on your place to get it fixed. And so you get letters written about getting additional labor to come in and basically save the fields, get the water out, repair the dikes, and put them back into shape. Next, please. These images, by the way, that you're looking at, this is LiDAR. This is the Earth's surface minus trees and buildings. And this is something that's been gathered by a plane-flown laser apparatus that takes literally trillions of points and then plots them. And this is a 3D, it's 2D now, but you can actually plot this in 3D and see resolution on the ground surface of about that much. So if you put a football on the ground, it'll turn into a pixel on the screen. So here is colonial dike, or late colonial or early federal period diking. It shows up really well. You can even see in some areas plow scars. So you can find literally plowed fields in where there's poplar trees this big now. Next, please. It's all about pattern recognition. And this is what one of those dikes looks like. It's now in a swamp, but that would have been cornfield in the 1840s. Next, please. And I was mentioning fields. Here's an example. You can see these linear striations. Those are all colonial and early 19th century fields. I don't think there's a bit of that that's actually cleared now.
Where is that?
This is just above where Chula Road crosses Flat Creek. And you can see where the creek has actually jumped its banks. Its old route was here, and it jumped down here. Next, please. I think I've got a better image of that area. Okay, no, this is Flat Creek. So this is where Flat Creek is today. This is where it used to go, and this is a residual dike right there, and that dates to about 1820 or so. So we know that Flat Creek has dramatically changed its course basically the last 100 years or so. The landowners on both sides did not know that until I showed them this, and they were like, well, that explains a lot. I mean, it is pretty amazing when you can have the opportunity to get back and get that 10,000 square foot or 10,000 foot view at your own place. A lot of folks didn't realize we've got these two things in Amelia, 2 Civil War forts, some of which have medieval apparatus built into them. Next, please. And we'll touch on that later. Porter's Mill, this is another example. I've actually got better LiDAR than that, so apologies for the kind of crappy version, but we can go back and find on a map where a mill was annotated. Mills show up on maps all the time. They're often close to where they actually were, but LiDAR often will show us exactly where the dam is, even if it's been cut through, and where the head race goes. If you can find the head race in the dam, you can find the old mill site. Next, please. Home features. These showed up all over the place. I thought naively maybe these are, I don't know, is it a big tree fall, but it's too big for that. These are 22 to 27 feet across. I mean, what are these? Is this associated with logging? What's going on? And then I got to thinking and doing a bit more walking in the woods. These are ice pits. And everywhere you find one of these, if you take a 200-foot radius and go around, you're going to find yourself an 18th or 19th century house where many are not known to have existed anymore. Even the maps don't have them there. It would only be going to the clerk's office and maybe doing meets and bounds to try to figure out where a house or a dwelling may have been. So these are kind of neat, and they often they follow a landform pattern to the T. I don't think I found any that broke it, which is this is a finger ridge coming down. This is the valley there. There's a creek coming down, so not surprising people like to build out on the tip of the finger ridge. So the predictive modeling for that, I worked with a colleague to develop a filter for GIS with LiDAR so we can use that to find all these little things in 20 square miles of data rather than pouring through it one by one. You find a lot of other things, but it's easier to go through the targets and eliminate the kind of the trash from these features than look through 20 square miles of LiDAR data. Next, please. And that's what they look like in the field. Next, please. Next. Good, next. And this is a site where we've actually got the ice pit there, and then the known location of historic structures, a bit closer than 200 feet in that case. Next, please. All right, so I'll go back to those unique LiDAR features I was showing you on this image earlier. You can go next.
Forward, okay.
So this is Flat Creek coming across here. I didn't expect to do the Civil War as part of this river and creek study, but the Richmond and Danville rail line only needs 3 bridges to get from Richmond to Danville. I think that's pretty incredible when you think about how long of a run that is. It needs to cross the Appomattox at Mattox, it needs to cross the Flat Creek near Tula, and it needs to cross the Stanton River near Randolph. And I had to think about that. And this is Flat Creek, and this is where it received the most of its attention during the Civil War. These are 2 forts that were never fought over and barely occupied, but there was a skirmish here in May of 1864. It scared the pants off the Richmond and Danville line, because with only 3 bridges, it only takes 1 of them to be out, and you stop service to Richmond. For whatever reason, it didn't scare the pants off Braxton Bragg in Richmond, which is probably why he got sidestepped. And by August of 1864, local enslaved labor had been dispatched to build 3 forts in Amelia County, 2 at Flat Creek, where fighting had actually occurred, and then 1 at Mattox. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the Mattox fort. And this is what it looks like in LiDAR image. I've walked the property a couple times with the owner, who also didn't realize the fort looked like this. He'd literally not grown up there, but grew up walking it over with his dad, you know, and he said, I had no idea there was that amount of stuff going on here. And what had happened, the short of the long, is a young Prussian immigrant to the United States in 1861 joins the Union Army to go get himself a medal, basically. He becomes an aide-de-camp to General Nathaniel Banks, gets captured at Warrenton after getting kicked out of Banks's army for drawing really crappy maps, and gets sent to Libby prison, swears he'll be a good Confederate, gets out basically on good behavior, moves to Danville to teach music at a women's school, and then in 1864, the Confederate Army says, we're in desperate need of military engineers. Does anybody in the room have a degree from a military institution? And he raised his hand. And the elder Charles de Norton-Toft at Chackey, I think I've got that somewhat close to right, ended up designing the only 3 forts he ever designed. He died penniless in Richmond after trying to be a musician and write patriotic songs about the Confederacy that surprisingly didn't sell very well in the 1870s. But he did build 3 forts. And I've worked with some fort people. I'm not a fort people, but these have medieval concepts and designs in them that you would have never conceived of building as a well-trained 19th century fort engineer. So I had to get out of my kayak to take a look at this, but this is a primary defense of Flat Creek and the rail crossing there. Next, please. So the project results from that were about 35 miles of river survey, a little bit of actual Flat Creek survey, a whole bunch of LiDAR analysis, and then a lot of site visits based on the LiDAR analysis and seeing things from the bank line that I needed permission to go. We at DHR used this basically as a predictive model for a much larger project that I'll give you the highlights of here. Next. We can go to the next, I've already told you that. To a 2023 project that will continue into next year. And this is pretty, it's pretty big, I think, for Virginia's maritime archaeology. I don't have a big boat to go out in the Chesapeake Bay of the Atlantic right now to go drag magnets and a sonar and find wrecks. That's something we contract out periodically to do, but we can go to areas where kayaks and canoes will go, and frankly places that haven't been given as much attention, but they have just as much maritime connection as anywhere else. So we can go to the next slide, please. You can read that on your own, but DHR received $4.7 million worth of funding as a response to Hurricanes Michael and Florence and the damage they did to the Commonwealth. Municipalities like Prince Edward County, like Amelia, like many other counties in the state were eligible for these funds. They could raise their hands, apply for them through various nonprofits as well as municipalities. and help restore damaged structures or be better prepared for knowing what is out there archaeologically. What did we lose? What might we lose in another similar event? So we were able to direct some of that money towards saying, all right, what's in our rivers? What are the rivers doing to it? How can we respond to this in a sensible manner? It doesn't mean saving everything. So often it means going out and documenting things and before they go. Next, please. So all of these red areas are areas that we have done work, are doing work, or have work contracted to do. The new river is as far west as we go, and we go all the way up to the Rappahannock, up here, and then down to the York River here on the east. Next, please. It's pretty aggressive in that it's actually going to end up serving about 6.4, that should read the entire state's riverine waters. So if my boss had said to me, would you go survey 7% of the state's rivers, in the next 2 years? Yes, you can use contractors, and yes, here's some money. I would say that's a pretty big, pretty tall order, but we're doing it. And we're using different models in different places to fit the environments, and also to try to pit some methods against each other and figure out what works the best. Next, please. So we're going out and documenting. This is on the Bannister River down in Halifax County. Next, please. This is hidden in plain sight in downtown South Boston, a lovely mill structure with its adjacent 1813 dam. Next, please. And for the first time here in the Commonwealth, they're actually documenting these. That just looks like a bunch of rocks. And it is a bunch of rocks, but they're arranged strategically to create a sluice through which bateau could travel. It's a way of making a navigable structure, creating something helpful out of an unhelpful structure. Next, please. So we've mapped, 20 or 30 of those at this point. And with the thanks and help of a lot of local folks here, did 17 miles above Farmville. That was done by a contractor, Burke Feb, out of Lynchburg. They've done several of these surveys for us. It's an excellent survey team. And I got to join them on a couple of occasions. Next, please. So I did a lot of drone flying on this, but this is the bypass canal here above town. And you can just see more, as I've said several times, when you get up and take a look down, than when you're just standing on the thing, you have the myopia of being too close to it. Next, please. So here's Morton's Mill, Upper Dam and Lock. This was conjectured by Bill Trout to have been pretty much washed away, done away with, gone, nothing left of it. But indeed, we still have some of the original crib work. This is the oldest and most surviving lock structure that we still have on the river. And some of it's still wood. It's still there. You can see it was also thought to have been blown up by the Confederates at the end of the war. That's not necessarily the case, but there is still a substantial component of that site left. Next, please. Even found a piece of a dugout canoe in the river. Not much of one, but next, please. Here in this snag, we were literally having lunch one day, and I looked down and saw this regular pattern in the water, which is dangerous for us because it means we're going to go in the water to go see what that regular pattern is. Next, please. So I went down and took pictures, and I'm pretty sure that these are the backboards for a cupboard that was built in the 19th century, and it's been in the river for whatever reason, probably a flood, probably covered over and then exposed and caught in this snag. But you can see where the shelves had been nailed from the back and pulled out, and the square nails were still there. Cut nails, 19th century, beautiful wide pine boards, and there was some beading on it and even some tongue and grooving. So I, of course, hopped in the water, went down there with the GoPro and took some images. I was really excited at first because I thought it was a boat. I was like, we're going to find a boat in the Upper Appomattox, but that wasn't the case. We found some furniture. That's all right. Next, please.
Hey, so the picture before
Go back if you don't mind.
before the last year, no, go back one more. Okay. Go back one more.
So go ahead.
No, you go ahead now.
Or which one? You have the furniture?
No, I think it was the canal. You said it goes around Farmville.
Yes.
That was the end of it.
Or
you were showing.
the first one was the end of it. The second picture was the beginning of it. That's the entrance for the Morton's Mill bypass canal.
Okay, you're talking about Morton's Mill, which is further up.
The two pictures I showed were both bypass canals.
Okay.
The first picture was the one just here, the bypass canal for the Appomattox, the Farmville Mills.
Because that looked familiar.
Yes, and then the second picture is further upstream,
Morton
and that's the Morton Mill,
Okay.
which is the older of the two. Next, please. You can keep going. keep going. That's pulling a nail out of it to get a sample of that. And here's the bypass canal you mentioned. So you can actually see the bypass
Yes.
going around town here, coming back in. Charlie's is right in here.
And then,
Next, please. This was probably the most unique thing we found.
Bypass.
Sir?
What was the purpose of that bypass?
So where you have a mill and a dam, you got to bypass it to get river traffic around it.
Okay, so you bring it.
Smaller mills would have a lock in the dam. It's convenient because you don't have to dig a big canal, but it's inconvenient because every flood destroys it. The better approach is to have a lock further upstream in the pool that's protected kind of off the water, and then have a canal go around as bypassing your mill. And they're often called skirting canals because they skirt an obstruction. This was, I think, the most interesting thing that we found. This was on the Cumberland side on Dr. Anderson's land. This shows up in LiDAR. Next slide, please. And it's straight. It's about 700 to 800 feet long, and it's a canal. And it's really not in any documentation that I have found yet. I'm sure there's mention of it. Right across from Israel Hill. But we believe this may be basically the Anderson's canal, so to speak, that it doesn't go anywhere. It probably connected to the river on both ends, definitely one end, but probably a little port for that plantation, a place that, and we know that the Anderson family owned bateau. So this is probably where you keep your bateau when you're not using them. So it's a little port, a little marina, basically. But these often don't survive logging or whatever, siltation, floods destroy them. We know about them. And this is the only example of one that I'm aware of that is still surviving, and it's pretty much intact. Next, please. So out of the conclusions we've generated to date, based on 4 out of 7 river surveys, we've got, well, these are kind of the ongoing conclusions. We know this, riparian areas, riverine areas are high energy places. They're always changing. But we also have the highest density of cultural resources there, more anywhere else than except maybe urban areas. And so constant survey of these things, checking back on sites, means finding new sites, finding attributes. Here's an example. You don't just go to site, dig it, see it, record it, and it's done. That's kind of an old trope. We went back, a colleague and I, to Swift Creek in Chesterfield County to go look at an old site that's been looked at a lot. And we just happened to find that day the foundation of Archibald Carey's 1750 iron forge, Virginia's oldest still standing iron forge. It had just been eroded out of the bank. The conjecture in popular scholastic research was that it had all washed away. And we just happened to be there the day that it had been recently exposed. So returning to these sites is important. Constant monitoring is important. And we're not going to always do that. It's up to people knowing about it, caring about it, being stewards of the shared resource. Next, please. So little side note here. What did Farmville look like in terms of river transportation in 1850? There were 40 bateaux registered here in town. 40% of the town's freight was on the water for a third of the price, remember. The majority of the boatmen were Israelites from Israel Hill. And this is the size of the maximum size of the boat, which is pretty big for the river. That's almost as big as the James River bateau. And of course, the width and the length is dictated by the size of the locks, because you have to fit these things into the lock. So any wider, they'll stick. Any longer, they won't go. Next, please. So with that, it's a pretty quick run through of a very complex topic. There's so much more out there to be learned about the Appomattox, but I guess my job is to remind us how maritime, how wet Farmville's feet have been for years. And so Farmville by water, please. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have. Otherwise, I don't want to get in the way of the cookies. But thank you for showing up tonight and supporting the Historical Society.